The autumn winds carried the scent of distant fires when Nahuel first spotted the lone figure stumbling across the dry grasslands that marked the boundary of their territory. As the village's primary scout, he had spent countless seasons watching these borderlands for signs of approaching enemies, migrating animals, or travelers seeking sanctuary among the Wayuu people. But he had never seen anyone moving with such desperate determination while clearly being so close to complete collapse. Before we continue with this haunting tale, please subscribe to keep receiving these incredible stories. And let me know in the comments, what part of the world are you listening from? The figure was a young woman, perhaps 20 summers old, whose swollen belly proclaimed her advanced pregnancy, even from a considerable distance. Her dark hair hung in tangled strands around a face that might have been beautiful under different circumstances, but now showed the ravages of hunger, exhaustion, and what appeared to be weeks of hard travel through hostile territory. Her clothing was torn and stained, made from materials that Nahuel did not recognize, suggesting she had come from lands far beyond their usual trading routes. What struck him most forcefully was not her obvious distress, but the way she moved across the landscape with purpose that transcended her physical limitations. This was not someone wandering aimlessly in search of help, but a person with a specific destination who would reach her goal through sheer force of will or die in the attempt. Nahuel watched from his concealed position among the rocks as the woman approached the traditional boundary markers that separated Wayuu territory from the neutral lands beyond. These ancient stone pillars had stood for generations, carved with symbols that warned strangers about the laws and customs they would be expected to follow if they chose to enter the domain of his people. The woman paused at the first marker, placing her hand against the weathered stone, as if drawing strength from contact with something that represented safety and permanence. For long moments, she remained motionless, her head bowed and her breathing labored from the exertion of her journey. Then she straightened her shoulders and continued walking toward the village that lay hidden in the valley beyond the hills. Nahuel faced a decision that would affect not only his own future, but potentially the stability of his entire community. Standing orders required him to intercept any strangers who approached their territory and escort them to the village council for questioning before they could enter the settlement proper. But the woman's condition was clearly critical, and any delay might result in her death along with that of her unborn child. The scout chose compassion over protocol, emerging from concealment to offer assistance rather than interrogation. As he approached, the woman turned toward him with eyes that held depths of pain and determination that seemed far too old for her apparent age. When she spoke, her voice carried the raspy quality of someone who had not tasted water for far too long. "I seek Akoni, chief of the Wayuu people," she said in their language, though her accent marked her as someone who had learned their tongue from distant teachers rather than growing up among their tribe. "I am Itzel, daughter of his blood. Come home to the family that cast me aside before my birth." The words hit Nahuel like a physical blow, not because of their political implications, but because of the absolute conviction with which they were spoken. This was not someone making desperate claims in hope of receiving charity, but a person stating facts that she believed with complete certainty, regardless of how others might respond to such declarations. Chief Akoni was indeed their leader, a man whose wisdom and strength had guided their people through decades of prosperity and challenge. But he was also someone whose personal life had been marked by tragedy and loss that had shaped his character in profound ways. The death of his beloved wife Xochitl during a plague that had swept through their region 15 years earlier had left him a changed man, devoted entirely to his duties as a leader while showing little interest in forming new personal relationships. More significantly for the present situation, Chief Akoni had never acknowledged having any children beyond the son who had died in infancy shortly before his wife's own death. The possibility that he might have fathered a child with someone outside his marriage was not impossible, but it would represent a betrayal of everything the community believed about his character and values. "You claim to be the chief's daughter," Nahuel said carefully, studying Itzel's face for signs of deception or delusion. "But Chief Akoni has never spoken of having children who survived beyond infancy." What proof do you offer of such a relationship? Itzel's response was to reach into the tattered remains of what had once been a traveling pack, withdrawing an object that made Nahuel's breath catch in his throat. It was a small carved amulet made from jade and silver, worked in patterns that were unmistakably Wayuu in origin. More specifically, it bore the distinctive markings that identified it as belonging to the chief's personal family line, symbols that were never shared with outsiders and rarely displayed even within their own community. "My mother gave this to me on her deathbed," Itzel said, holding the amulet where Nahuel could see it clearly. "She told me it was a gift from the man who had loved her deeply, but could not claim their child without destroying the political alliances that kept his people safe from their enemies." The story was plausible in ways that made Nahuel deeply uncomfortable. 15 years ago, Chief Akoni had indeed been involved in delicate negotiations with neighboring tribes, whose cooperation was essential for maintaining peace in their region. A scandal involving an illegitimate child might well have destroyed those agreements, leading to conflicts that could have cost hundreds of lives. But the scout also knew that such amulets could be stolen, traded, or counterfeited by skilled craftsmen who understood their significance. The mere possession of authentic Wayuu artifacts did not prove family relationships, especially when the political stakes of such claims were so high. "I will escort you to the village," Nahuel decided, choosing a middle path that would allow wiser minds to evaluate Itzel's claims. "But you should understand that Chief Akoni will not welcome accusations that challenge his honor or threaten the stability of our community." Itzel nodded in acceptance of these terms, though her expression suggested she had expected no other response. As they began walking toward the village, she shared fragments of her story that painted a picture of hardship and determination that had brought her across vast distances to reach this moment. She had been raised by her mother Yaretsi in a small settlement that lay far to the south, beyond the great desert where few Wayuu people ever traveled. Yaretsi had been a healer and midwife whose skills were valued by the mixed community of refugees and traders who made their homes in that harsh borderland between established tribal territories. Growing up, Itzel had been told that her father was a great chief from the northern lands, whose responsibilities to his people prevented him from acknowledging their relationship openly. Her mother had described him as a man of honor who had made difficult choices for the greater good, someone who would welcome his daughter if circumstances ever allowed such a reunion. Yaretsi had died during the previous winter, succumbing to a wasting disease that no amount of healing knowledge could cure. On her deathbed, she had finally revealed the full truth about Itzel's parentage, including details about Chief Akoni's appearance, personality, and family history that could not have been learned from casual contact or second-hand stories. She described the scar on his left shoulder, earned during his initiation trials as a young warrior, Itzel told Nahuel as they walked. She knew about his habit of touching his temple when deep in thought, the way he prefers his morning meal prepared, and the songs he would sing when he believed no one was listening. Such intimate details suggested either genuine personal knowledge or incredibly thorough intelligence gathering for purposes that remained unclear. Nahuel found himself torn between sympathy for a pregnant woman seeking help and suspicion about motives that might involve threats to his people's security. The conversation was interrupted when Itzel suddenly stopped walking, her face pale and her breathing rapid. The physical demands of their journey, combined with her advanced pregnancy, had finally overcome her determination to reach the village through willpower alone. She swayed on her feet for a moment before collapsing to her knees, one hand pressed to her swollen belly, while the other clutched at the grass to prevent herself from falling completely. "The baby," she gasped, her voice tight with pain that had clearly been building for some time. "Something is wrong. The pain started during the night, but I thought I could reach safety before." Nahuel had no experience with childbirth, but he recognized the signs of someone whose body was preparing for labor regardless of whether the timing was convenient or safe. Itzel needed immediate assistance from healers who possessed the knowledge and supplies necessary to help both mother and child survive what could become a very dangerous situation. The scout made a decision that violated every protocol he had been taught about handling potentially dangerous strangers. Instead of proceeding slowly toward the village while maintaining proper security precautions, he lifted Itzel in his arms and began running as fast as his legs could carry him toward the settlement where help might be available. Itzel was heavier than her slight frame suggested, weighed down by pregnancy and the supplies she had carried across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain. But Nahuel had been trained for endurance as well as observation, and he managed to maintain a pace that covered the remaining distance to the village in less than half the time their careful walk would have required. The commotion of his arrival drew immediate attention from villagers who were accustomed to quiet efficiency from their scouts, rather than dramatic emergencies that required urgent response. Within moments, Nahuel found himself surrounded by people offering help while simultaneously demanding explanations for the unconscious pregnant woman he carried. Chief Akoni emerged from his dwelling as word of the disturbance reached him, his weathered face showing the calm authority that had made him an effective leader for over 2 decades. He was a tall man whose bearing reflected both physical strength and the confidence that came from making difficult decisions under pressure. The silver in his black hair spoke of wisdom earned through experience, while the scars on his arms told stories of battles fought to protect his people from various threats. When he saw Itzel's unconscious form, the chief's expression shifted from administrative concern to something more personal that he tried unsuccessfully to hide. For just a moment, his careful composure cracked enough to reveal emotions that suggested recognition rather than simple compassion for a stranger in distress. "Take her to Shitlali immediately," he ordered, referring to their most skilled healer and midwife. "Everything else can wait until we know whether the mother and child will survive." Shitlali was a woman whose knowledge of healing had been gathered over 4 decades of treating every type of injury and illness that could affect their community. Her dwelling doubled as a medical center, where the most serious cases received treatment that combined traditional herbal remedies with techniques learned through trade relationships with distant peoples. The healer took one look at Itzel's condition and began issuing rapid orders for supplies and assistance that would be needed to deal with what appeared to be premature labor, complicated by exhaustion and malnutrition. Her movements were efficient and purposeful, reflecting the kind of calm competence that saved lives during medical emergencies. "Clear the dwelling of everyone except those I specifically request," Shitlali commanded as she began examining her new patient. "This birth will be difficult enough without curious observers creating additional distractions." Chief Akoni found himself reluctantly ushered outside along with everyone else, though his obvious desire to remain nearby did not go unnoticed by the villagers who had gathered to witness these unusual events. For a leader who typically maintained emotional distance from personal matters, his concern for a pregnant stranger seemed unusually intense. Nahuel took advantage of this period of waiting to provide a detailed report about his encounter with Itzel, including her claims about being the chief's daughter and the evidence she had offered to support such assertions. The carved amulet was examined by several elders whose knowledge of tribal artifacts made them qualified to assess its authenticity. "This is genuine Wayuu craftsmanship," confirmed Elder Itzamna, whose expertise in traditional arts made his opinion particularly valuable. "More specifically, it bears the personal markings that identify it as belonging to the chief's family line. Such objects are never given to outsiders, and the techniques required to create convincing forgeries are known to very few craftsmen." The confirmation created an atmosphere of tension among the gathered villagers, as people struggled to process the implications of what they were learning. If Itzel was indeed Chief Akoni's daughter, her arrival raised questions about his past that could affect their community's understanding of his character and judgment. But equally troubling was the possibility that someone might be using sophisticated deception to exploit their chief's emotional vulnerabilities for purposes that could threaten their collective security. The timing of Itzel's arrival, during a season when several neighboring tribes were experiencing political instability, raised suspicions about motives that might extend beyond simple family reunification. Chief Akoni himself remained silent during these discussions, his face revealing nothing about his thoughts or feelings regarding the situation that was unfolding around him. but those who knew him well could see signs of internal struggle that suggested the pregnant woman's claims had affected him more deeply than he was willing to acknowledge publicly. The birth itself proved to be as difficult as Kitlali had predicted, lasting through the night and into the following morning, as the healer fought to save both mother and child from complications that threatened both their lives. The sounds that emerged from the medical dwelling told a story of pain and struggle that kept the entire village awake with concern for people they barely knew. When the cries of a newborn finally pierced the dawn air, the collective sigh of relief from the gathered crowd could be heard throughout the settlement. Kitlali emerged from her dwelling looking exhausted but satisfied, carrying news that both mother and child had survived the ordeal despite the challenging circumstances of the birth. "The baby is small but healthy," she announced to the anxious crowd. "A boy whose lungs work perfectly and whose appetite suggests he will grow strong despite his early arrival. The mother will need time to recover from her ordeal, but she should return to full health with proper rest and nutrition." Chief Akoni stepped forward as the crowd began to disperse, his expression carefully neutral as he prepared to ask questions that would determine how his community would respond to these unexpected guests. But before he could speak, Kitlali gestured for him to follow her back into the dwelling where Itzel and her newborn son were resting. What the chief saw there would haunt him for the rest of his life, regardless of how the larger questions about identity and relationships were ultimately resolved. The baby boy who had just entered the world bore a distinctive birthmark on his left shoulder, a crescent-shaped discoloration that was identical to one that Chief Akoni himself had carried since birth. The mark was not something that could be faked or created through artificial means. It was a genetic trait that had appeared in his family line for generations, so distinctive that tribal records specifically mentioned its presence in various ancestors whose deeds had shaped their people's history. More disturbing still was the way the baby's features, even in the hours immediately following birth, seemed to echo aspects of Akoni's own appearance at a similar age. The shape of his eyes, the curve of his lips, the way his tiny hands moved when he was awake, all suggested genetic connections that could not be dismissed as coincidence or wishful thinking. Itzel herself remained unconscious during this initial examination, her body exhausted by the trauma of giving birth under such difficult circumstances. But even in sleep, her face showed a resemblance to features that Akoni remembered from his own youth, similarities that became more apparent when observed alongside the baby, who had inherited characteristics from both parents. Kitlali watched the chief's reaction carefully, her experience with human nature allowing her to read emotions that he was trying unsuccessfully to hide. As someone who had assisted with hundreds of births over the decades, she understood the significance of genetic markers that proved family relationships beyond any reasonable doubt. "The birthmark is identical to yours," she said quietly, speaking words that no one else in the village would have dared to voice. "Not similar or resembling, but exactly the same in size, shape, and position. Combined with his other features, this child could only be your blood grandson." The statement hung in the air between them like a blade waiting to fall, carrying implications that would reshape everything about how the chief understood his own past and the responsibilities that past had created. If the baby was indeed his grandson, then Itzel's claims about being his daughter were almost certainly true, regardless of how much he might prefer to deny such connections. But acknowledging the relationship would require admitting to intimate involvement with someone other than his beloved wife, violating the image of devoted widowhood that had defined his public persona for 15 years. More practically, it would create political complications that could affect his ability to lead effectively during a period when strong leadership was essential for their community's survival. Chief Akoni stared at the sleeping baby for long minutes, his mind racing through memories and implications that he had spent years trying to forget. Finally, he spoke in a voice that carried the weight of decisions that would affect multiple generations of his people. "No one else must know about the birthmark until I have had time to consider what response would best serve our community's interests," he said, though his words lacked the conviction that usually characterized his pronouncements. "This situation requires careful thought about consequences that extend far beyond personal considerations." Kitlali nodded in understanding, though her expression suggested disagreement with the chief's impulse to conceal important information from his people. As someone whose life was dedicated to healing and helping others, she found it difficult to support actions that prioritized politics over human relationships. But she also understood the complex pressures that shaped leadership decisions during uncertain times. The Wayuu people faced threats from multiple directions, including neighboring tribes whose own political instability made conflict increasingly likely. Any scandal that weakened their chief's authority could have devastating consequences for everyone who depended on his guidance. Over the following days, as Itzel slowly recovered from the ordeal of childbirth, the village settled into an uneasy routine that accommodated the presence of mysterious guests whose ultimate intentions remained unclear. The young woman was provided with food, shelter, and medical care that reflected their people's traditions of hospitality, but she was also kept under discreet observation that ensured her movements were carefully monitored. Itzel herself seemed content to rest and care for her newborn son, while avoiding conversations that might force premature resolutions to questions about her identity and purpose. When villagers attempted to engage her in discussions about her past or her plans for the future, she would respond with gentle deflections that provided interesting details, without revealing anything of strategic importance. She shared stories about her childhood in the southern borderlands, describing a harsh but beautiful landscape where survival required constant adaptation to changing conditions. Her mother, Yaretsi, had been respected as a healer whose skills attracted patients from throughout the region, creating a diverse household where Itzel had learned multiple languages and customs from the various peoples who sought medical assistance. But when asked about specific details that might allow verification of her claims, Itzel would become vague or change the subject to less sensitive topics. Her knowledge of Wayuu customs and traditions was impressive, but could have been acquired through careful study rather than childhood immersion. Her emotional reactions to certain names and places seemed genuine, but skilled actors could produce convincing performances when the stakes were high enough. Most troubling to those who watched her carefully was the way she seemed to be studying the village and its inhabitants with the systematic attention of someone gathering intelligence rather than simply recovering from a difficult journey. Her questions about local customs, leadership structures, and defensive capabilities might represent innocent curiosity, but they could also indicate preparation for activities that threatened their community's security. Chief Akoni himself maintained careful distance from both Itzel and her baby, conducting his normal duties while avoiding situations that might force him to make premature decisions about their status within the community. But those who knew him well could see that the situation was affecting him more deeply than he was willing to acknowledge. His sleep had become restless, marked by dreams that left him exhausted rather than refreshed. His appetite had decreased noticeably, and he often seemed distracted during important meetings where his full attention was normally guaranteed. Most significantly, he had begun making excuses to avoid the ceremonial duties that had previously brought him satisfaction and spiritual peace. The change in their leader's behavior did not go unnoticed by the village elders, whose support was essential for maintaining effective governance. Elder Itsamna, in particular, began asking pointed questions about the chief's health and emotional state, suggesting that some form of intervention might be necessary if the situation continued to deteriorate. A leader who cannot sleep peacefully is a leader whose judgment may be compromised by concerns that outweigh his duty to his people, the elder observed during a private conversation with several other senior advisors. Perhaps it is time to address these personal matters directly, rather than allowing them to fester in secrecy. The suggestion that Chief Akoni's leadership might be suffering because of his emotional turmoil was not something that could be ignored indefinitely. The Wayuu people had prospered under his guidance for 2 decades precisely because of his ability to make difficult decisions based on rational analysis rather than personal feelings. But the current situation seemed to have triggered responses that bypassed his normal decision-making processes, creating a paralysis that served no one's interests, while potentially creating vulnerabilities that enemies might exploit. The village council would soon need to consider whether intervention was necessary to protect their community's stability. The crisis that forced these issues into the open came when scouts reported unusual activity along their borders, suggesting that neighboring tribes were conducting reconnaissance that might precede more aggressive actions. The information required immediate response from their leadership, but Chief Oconee seemed unable to focus on strategic planning, while the questions about Itzel's identity remained unresolved. During the emergency council session called to address these external threats, the chief's distraction became so obvious that Elder Itzamna felt compelled to speak directly about the personal matters that were affecting their collective security. "We cannot defend our people effectively while our leader's attention is divided between his duties and his doubts," the elder declared with the bluntness that came from decades of experience in handling delicate political situations. "The time has come to resolve the questions surrounding our mysterious guests so that we can focus on the genuine threats that approach our borders." The confrontation that followed would determine not only the fate of Itzel and her baby, but the future of Chief Oconee's relationship with the people who had trusted him to guide them through whatever challenges they might face. The truth about past relationships and present responsibilities could no longer be avoided, regardless of how painful that truth might prove to be. Chief Oconee looked around the council chamber at faces that reflected concern, confusion, and growing impatience with his inability to address the situation decisively. These were people who had supported him through numerous crises, who deserved explanations that would allow them to understand the stakes involved in the decisions they would be asked to make. Finally, the chief spoke with a voice that carried all the authority he could summon despite the emotional turmoil that threatened to overwhelm his normally steady demeanor. 15 years ago, during the negotiations that secured our current peace agreements with the southern tribes, I formed a relationship with a healer named Yoretzi, whose community provided neutral ground for our diplomatic meetings, he began, speaking words that he had never intended to share with anyone. The admission sent ripples of shock through the council chamber as people processed the implications of what their leader was revealing about his past. Chief Oconee had always been regarded as a model of moral behavior, whose devotion to his deceased wife had never wavered even during the loneliest years of his widowhood. The relationship was brief but intense, occurring during a period when I believed my wife's death had ended any possibility of personal happiness, the chief continued, his voice growing stronger as he committed himself to complete honesty regardless of the consequences. When the negotiations concluded and I returned home, I chose to focus on my duties as a leader, rather than pursuing personal connections that might compromise my effectiveness. He paused to study the faces around him, reading expressions that ranged from disappointment to understanding, as his people struggled to reconcile this new information with their existing beliefs about his character. "I never knew that our relationship had resulted in a child," Chief Oconee concluded. "If I had known, I would have found ways to provide support and recognition that honored both the child's needs and my responsibilities to this community." The silence that followed his confession was broken only by the sound of wind moving through the trees outside the council chamber, carrying with it the scents and sounds of a world that seemed suddenly more complex and dangerous than it had appeared just moments earlier. Elder Itzamna was the first to speak, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone whose long experience had taught him to consider all angles of complicated situations before offering judgment. "If what you say is true, then the young woman and her child have legitimate claims on your support and recognition," he said carefully. "But their arrival at this particular time, when our borders face pressure from multiple directions, raises questions about timing that cannot be ignored." The elder's observation highlighted the strategic dimensions of the situation that complicated what might otherwise have been a purely personal matter. If Itzel was indeed the chief's daughter, her sudden appearance after years of absence might represent coincidence, or it might indicate coordination with forces that sought to destabilize their community during a vulnerable period. "We need more information about her background and her reasons for coming here now," declared Elder Nomi, whose responsibilities included monitoring threats to their community's security. Claims of family relationship must be balanced against possibilities of deception designed to exploit our leader's emotional vulnerabilities. The discussion that followed revealed deep divisions within the council about how to balance humanitarian concerns against security considerations, Some members felt that family obligations took precedence over political calculations, while others argued that the safety of their entire community outweighed any individual relationships. Chief Oconee found himself caught between competing loyalties that seemed impossible to reconcile through conventional means. His duty as a leader demanded that he prioritize collective security over personal feelings, but his conscience rebelled against abandoning a daughter and grandson whose existence he had only recently discovered. The debate continued through the afternoon and into the evening, as council members struggled with questions that had no easy answers, while external threats continued to develop along their borders. Scout reports indicated that at least 3 neighboring tribes were coordinating activities that suggested preparation for significant military action, though the specific targets of such campaigns remained unclear. As darkness fell and the immediate council session was suspended until the following day, Chief Oconee made his way through the village to check on the defensive preparations that were proceeding, regardless of how the political questions were ultimately resolved. But his route took him past the dwelling where Itzel and her baby were housed, and he found himself stopping to listen to the sounds that emerged from within. Through the walls, he could hear Itzel singing a lullaby to her restless child, her voice carrying melodies that were hauntingly familiar, despite being songs he had not heard for many years. The tune was one that Yaretsi had hummed during their brief time together, a healing song that she claimed could calm both physical pain and emotional distress. The memory hit Chief Oconee with unexpected force, bringing back images and feelings that he had thought were safely buried in the past. Yaretsi had been unlike anyone he had met before or since, a woman whose spiritual strength had helped him process the grief of losing his wife and infant son to circumstances beyond anyone's control. Their relationship had indeed been brief, lasting only the few weeks required to complete the diplomatic negotiations that had secured peace for his people. But it had also been profound in ways that had shaped his understanding of himself and his capacity for forming connections with others during his darkest emotional period. Standing outside Itzel's dwelling and listening to echoes of memories that had sustained him through the worst period of his life, Chief Oconee finally understood why he had been unable to think clearly about the situation that confronted him. The young woman was not just a stranger making claims about family relationships. She was a living link to a time when he had rediscovered hope after believing it was lost forever. But this emotional recognition did not resolve the practical problems that her presence created for his community's security and his own effectiveness as a leader. If anything, confirming his personal connection to Itzel made the political dimensions of the situation more complex rather than simpler. As he continued his evening inspection of their defensive preparations, Chief Oconee realized that the approaching crisis would force him to make choices that would define not only his own legacy, but the future of everyone who depended on his leadership. The external threats and internal complications had become intertwined in ways that made conventional solutions impossible to implement. The resolution would require wisdom that transcended normal political calculations, courage that went beyond simple battlefield bravery, and sacrifices that might cost him everything he valued most in order to protect the people who had trusted him with their lives and their future. But even as he prepared for the most difficult decisions of his career, Chief Oconee could not shake the feeling that forces beyond his control were shaping events in ways that no amount of planning or preparation could fully address. The arrival of his daughter and grandson had triggered changes that would ripple through their community for generations, regardless of how the immediate crisis was resolved. In the distance, the first watchfires of the night began to flicker to life, their warm light offering comfort against the darkness, while also serving as beacons that could guide friends towards safety or betray their location to enemies who moved under cover of shadow. Like so much else in his current situation, the fires represented both protection and vulnerability, hope and danger intertwined in ways that made simple judgments impossible to reach. The next morning brought news that would transform their defensive concerns into immediate crisis, as scouts reported the approach of a combined force from 3 neighboring tribes whose coordination suggested careful planning and hostile intent. The army that marched toward their territory was larger than anything their community could hope to resist through conventional means, requiring either evacuation or diplomatic solutions that might prove impossible to achieve. But even as Chief Oconee prepared to address this existential threat to his people's survival, the personal questions surrounding Itzel and her baby continued to demand attention that could affect his ability to lead effectively during their most desperate hour. The timing of these convergent crises seemed designed to test his leadership in ways that would reveal whether he possessed the wisdom and strength necessary to guide his people through challenges that threatened their very existence. The final revelation that would tie together all these seemingly separate threats was still to come, and it would force Chief Oconee to confront the possibility that his personal past and his people's present danger were connected in ways that no one had anticipated. The breakthrough came when Nahuel, still haunted by questions about Itzel's true origins and motivations, decided to conduct his own investigation into her background. As the scout who had first encountered her, he felt responsible for any threats her presence might pose to their community. His inquiries began with careful examination of the supplies and personal items she had carried during her journey to their territory. Most of what Itzel possessed seemed consistent with her claimed identity as a healer's daughter from the southern borderlands. Her medical supplies included herbs and preparations that were known to grow in desert regions, while her clothing showed wear patterns typical of someone who had traveled vast distances through harsh terrain. But buried among these innocent items, Nahuel discovered objects that told a very different story about her recent activities. Hidden within the false bottom of her traveling pack were documents written in multiple languages, including some that Nahuel recognized as belonging to the 3 tribes whose armies were now approaching their borders. The papers contained detailed maps of Wayuu territory, complete with notations about defensive positions, water sources, and potential routes for military operations. More disturbing still were written communications that revealed ongoing coordination between Itzel and leaders from the hostile tribes, discussions that dated back several months and included specific plans for destabilizing Wayuu leadership through psychological warfare designed to exploit Chief Oconee's emotional vulnerabilities. The documents painted a picture of a conspiracy that was far more sophisticated than anyone had imagined, involving not just military threats, but carefully orchestrated personal attacks designed to undermine their chief's ability to organize effective resistance. Itzel's arrival had not been coincidental, but rather the culmination of a long-term strategy to divide their community from within, while external forces prepared to attack from without. But perhaps most shocking of all was evidence that Itzel's claims about her parentage might actually be true, even though her current mission involved betraying the father she had never known. The conspiracy had apparently recruited her by convincing her that Chief Oconee had deliberately abandoned her and her mother, painting him as a heartless leader who valued political convenience over family obligations. Nahuel brought this intelligence to Chief Oconee privately, hoping to avoid the panic that would result if such information became widely known before defensive preparations could be completed. The chief's reaction to learning about his daughter's role in the conspiracy was devastating to witness, as a man known for his emotional control struggled to process betrayal that cut deeper than any enemy weapon. "She truly is my daughter," Chief Oconee said, after reading through the captured documents, his voice hollow with a pain that transcended simple political calculation. "The intelligence she provided about my personal habits and psychological weaknesses could only have come from someone who knew intimate details about my relationship with her mother." The confirmation that Itzel was indeed his daughter made her betrayal infinitely more painful, while also revealing how their enemies had gained access to strategic information that should have been impossible for outsiders to obtain. Through her mother's memories and her own careful observation during her stay in their village, Itzel had compiled intelligence that would make their defensive efforts far more difficult to coordinate effectively. "What are your orders regarding the prisoner?" Nahuel asked, using formal language that reflected the gravity of their situation while acknowledging the personal anguish that any decision would cause their leader. Chief Oconee stared at the documents for long minutes, his mind wrestling with options that seemed to offer only different types of devastating consequences. Executing Itzel for treason would eliminate a security threat while sending a message about the price of betraying their people. But it would also mean killing his own daughter and orphaning a grandson whose innocent presence had already begun to affect his emotional equilibrium. Alternatively, attempting to convert Itzel's loyalty through emotional appeals, might succeed if her hatred for her father was based on misinformation that could be corrected. But it might also provide her with additional opportunities to gather intelligence or coordinate with the approaching enemy forces. "We cannot make this decision in isolation," Chief Oconee finally concluded. "The Council must know about the threat she represents, but they must also understand the personal dimensions that complicate our response options." The emergency council session that followed was one of the most difficult in their community's history, as leaders struggled to balance justice against mercy while facing existential threats that demanded immediate action. The revelation that their mysterious guest was both the chief's daughter and an enemy agent created political complications that had no precedent in tribal law or custom. Elder Itzamna spoke for many when he observed that the situation required responses that transcended normal categories of judgment. "We face an enemy who has weaponized our leader's own blood against us," he said with obvious sadness. Traditional concepts of guilt and innocence become meaningless when family relationships are corrupted by forces that seek our destruction. Elder Nomi took a harsher position, arguing that Itzel's family connections made her betrayal even more serious rather than providing grounds for leniency. "Someone who would spy against the father who gave her life represents a threat that goes beyond simple military intelligence," she declared. "Such corruption of natural bonds suggests spiritual poison that could spread throughout our community if not eliminated completely." The debate revealed fundamental differences about human nature and the possibility of redemption that reflected deeper philosophical divisions within their leadership. Some council members believed that people could change when presented with truth that contradicted the lies they had been told, while others argued that someone capable of betraying family bonds could never be trusted regardless of their motivations. Chief Oconee listened to these arguments while grappling with emotions that threatened to overwhelm his capacity for rational decision-making. The evidence of Itzel's betrayal was clear and damning, but he could not forget the way she had sung lullabies to her baby, using melodies that connected her to the woman he had once loved deeply. The situation became even more complex when Citlali reported that she had observed Itzel attempting to communicate with someone outside the village using signals that were too subtle for casual observation to detect. The healer had noticed because her medical training required attention to small changes in behavior that might indicate illness or distress. "She uses patterns of movement in her dwelling that correspond to the positions of guards and patrols," Citlali explained to the assembled council. "The timing suggests she is providing information about our defensive preparations to someone who observes from a concealed position beyond our perimeter." This intelligence confirmed that the conspiracy extended beyond Itzel herself to include agents who were already positioned to coordinate the final assault on their community. The approaching armies represented only the most visible aspect of a campaign that involved infiltration, intelligence gathering, and psychological warfare, designed to maximize the effectiveness of their military operations. The council's deliberations were interrupted by urgent reports from border scouts who had observed the enemy forces taking positions that would allow them to launch coordinated attacks from multiple directions simultaneously. The window for evacuation had closed, making military resistance their only option for survival, despite the overwhelming odds they faced. Chief Oconee realized that he could no longer afford the luxury of prolonged deliberation about family relationships when the immediate survival of his entire community hung in the balance. Whatever decision he made about Itzel would have to serve the larger goal of protecting everyone who depended on his leadership. "She will be confined under maximum security until after the battle," he announced, choosing a temporary solution that postponed the most difficult choices while addressing immediate security concerns. "If we survive the coming assault, we can revisit questions about justice and redemption under less desperate circumstances." The decision satisfied no one completely, but it allowed the council to focus on military preparations that would determine whether any of them lived to face future moral dilemmas. Enemy forces were already moving into final attack positions, suggesting that the assault would begin within hours rather than days. As village defenders prepared for what many believed would be their final battle, Chief Oconee found himself torn between his duties as a military commander and his need to confront Itzel directly about the choices that had brought them to this desperate moment. The conversation he needed to have with his daughter might be his last opportunity to understand the forces that had shaped her into someone capable of such devastating betrayal. He found Itzel in the secure dwelling where she was being held, nursing her baby with an expression of serene contentment that seemed completely at odds with the chaos she had helped to create. When she looked up and saw him standing in the doorway, her face showed no surprise or guilt, only a calm satisfaction that suggested complete confidence in the righteousness of her actions. "You came to see your grandson before the battle that will end your reign," she said with voice that carried neither hatred nor affection, only the flat certainty of someone stating obvious facts. "He will survive what follows, as will I. Our allies have promised safe passage in exchange for the services I have provided." Chief Oconee studied his daughter's face, searching for signs of the woman who had given birth to her, and hoping to find some trace of humanity that might allow for understanding, if not reconciliation. But what he saw was someone whose capacity for emotional connection had been deliberately destroyed by people who understood how to weaponize personal relationships. "Your mother loved you deeply," he said, speaking words that carried all the tenderness he had never been able to express during her childhood. "If she could see what you have become, it would break her heart more completely than any physical suffering she endured." For just a moment, Itzel's composed facade cracked enough to reveal the pain that had been buried beneath layers of indoctrination and manipulation. The mention of her mother's love seemed to trigger memories that competed with the hatred she had been taught to nurture for the father who had never acknowledged her existence. "She died believing you would welcome me if I ever found the courage to seek you out," Itzel whispered, her voice breaking slightly as suppressed emotions fought against the psychological conditioning that had shaped her into an enemy agent. "She died still making excuses for the man who had abandoned us both to preserve his political reputation." The accusation contained enough truth to cut deeply, as Chief Oconee acknowledged to himself that his choices 15 years earlier had indeed prioritized community responsibilities over personal relationships. But it also revealed how his enemies had twisted legitimate grievances into weapons designed to destroy both father and daughter, while serving goals that had nothing to do with justice or healing. "I made choices that I thought served the greater good," he admitted, speaking with the honesty that came from facing probable death in the hours ahead. "If I had known about your existence, I would have found ways to honor both my duties as a leader and my obligations as a father." Itzel's response was a laugh that held no warmth, only bitter amusement at what she perceived as self-serving justifications offered too late to matter. "Your obligations as a father? You speak of duties you never fulfilled to a daughter you never acknowledged. What obligations could you possibly claim now that armies gather to destroy everything you have built?" The conversation might have continued indefinitely, circling around grievances and regrets that could never be fully resolved. But it was interrupted by the sound of war horns echoing across the valley. The attack had begun, forcing Chief Oconee to abandon his attempts at personal reconciliation in favor of the immediate task of organizing his community's desperate defense. As he prepared to leave for the battle that would determine their fate, Chief Oconee took one last look at his daughter and grandson, wondering if he would survive to continue their conversation, or if these final moments of bitter honesty would define their entire relationship. "If we survive this night, I will spend whatever time remains to me trying to earn forgiveness for the pain my choices caused," he said, knowing that words alone could not heal wounds that had festered for 20 years. "But if we do not survive, know that learning of your existence has been both the greatest joy and the deepest sorrow of my life." Itzel's only response was to turn away from him and focus her attention on the baby, who represented the future she believed her allies would create after destroying the community that had sheltered them both. Her silence spoke louder than any words could have, conveying rejection that was final and absolute. The battle that followed tested every assumption about warfare that the Wayuu people had developed through generations of conflict with various enemies. The attacking forces employed tactics that combined conventional military strategies with supernatural elements that seemed designed to sow terror and confusion among defenders who were already outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Warriors who had trained their entire lives for combat found themselves facing enemies whose movements defied natural laws, whose weapons seemed to cut through normal defenses with impossible ease, whose very presence created psychological effects that undermined courage and unity among even the most experienced fighters. Chief Oconee led the defense from the front lines, his presence inspiring desperate courage among people who understood that defeat would mean not just death, but the complete destruction of everything their ancestors had built in this valley. His tactical decisions were sound, and his personal example unquestionable, but individual heroism could not overcome the overwhelming advantages that their enemies possessed. As the night wore on, and defensive positions fell one by one to the inexorable advance of superior forces, it became clear that the Wayuu community was facing its final hours. The evacuation routes had been cut off, the fighting strength of their warriors was steadily depleting, and the supernatural abilities of their enemies were proving impossible to counter with conventional weapons. It was during this darkest moment that the intervention occurred, which would reshape the entire conflict in ways that no one could have anticipated. From within the secure dwelling where Itzel was being held, a sound emerged that cut through the chaos of battle like a blade through silk. The cries of her baby boy, not in distress, but in what seemed like supernatural summoning. The sound appeared to affect the attacking forces in ways that violated everything anyone understood about warfare or spiritual combat. Warriors who had been advancing with unstoppable momentum suddenly stopped in their tracks, their weapons falling from nerveless fingers as they stared toward the village center where the infant's voice continued to rise above all other sounds. More remarkably still, the supernatural abilities that had given the enemy forces their decisive advantage began to falter and fail, as if some power greater than their dark magic was asserting dominance over the spiritual dimensions of the battlefield. The tide of battle that had been flowing inexorably toward Wayuu defeat suddenly stopped and began to reverse. Chief Oconee, fighting desperately to protect a group of elder women and children who had been trapped by the enemy advance, witnessed the change with amazement that bordered on disbelief. Enemies who had seemed invincible moments earlier were now retreating in confusion, their coordinated assault dissolving into chaos as their supernatural advantages evaporated without explanation. The baby's cries continued throughout the night, providing what could only be described as spiritual protection for the Wayuu defenders, while simultaneously disrupting the enemy's ability to coordinate their attacks. By dawn, the assault had collapsed completely, with surviving enemy forces fleeing back toward their own territories in disorder that suggested panic rather than tactical withdrawal. The aftermath of the battle revealed casualties that were far lighter than anyone had dared hope, though the community had still paid a heavy price for their survival. More puzzling was the complete failure of enemy supernatural abilities, which had been neutralized by forces that no one could identify or understand. Chief Oconee made his way back to the dwelling where Itzel and her baby had been confined, hoping to find answers to questions that transcended normal military analysis. What he discovered there would haunt him for the remainder of his days, raising spiritual questions that challenged everything he thought he understood about family, loyalty, and the mysterious forces that shaped human destiny. Itzel was gone, having vanished sometime during the night without leaving any trace of her passage or any indication of how she had escaped from a building that had been secured by multiple guards. Her baby remained behind, sleeping peacefully in a makeshift cradle that showed no signs of the disturbance that should have resulted from his mother's departure. But most mysteriously of all, placed carefully on the altar where Itzel had apparently conducted some form of ceremony before her disappearance, was a single broken branch from the sacred tree that stood at the center of their village. The branch had been placed with obvious deliberation, its position suggesting symbolic significance that went beyond simple coincidence. The broken branch was from a tree that was said to connect the physical world with spiritual realms where ancestors dwelled, a living symbol of the continuity between past and present that defined their people's understanding of their place in the cosmos. Breaking such a branch without permission was considered a serious violation of sacred law, but the manner of its placement suggested ritual purpose rather than random vandalism. Kitlali, whose knowledge of spiritual traditions made her the most qualified person to interpret such symbols, studied the scene carefully before offering her analysis of what had occurred during the night. Her conclusions would add new dimensions to mysteries that were already difficult to comprehend. She performed a protection ritual using her own life force as the offering, the healer explained, her voice heavy with sadness for someone who had made the ultimate sacrifice to protect people she had been taught to hate. The broken branch represents the severing of connections between worlds that was necessary to channel protective power through her child. The implications of this interpretation suggested that Itzel had undergone a fundamental transformation during the hours when her community faced destruction, choosing to sacrifice herself to save people who had every reason to reject her. The supernatural protection that had saved the YU defenders had been purchased with the life of someone who had arrived as their enemy, but died as their protector. Chief Oconee stared at the broken branch while struggling to process emotions that seemed too complex for human consciousness to contain. His daughter had betrayed him and his people, but she had also saved them through sacrifice that demonstrated love deeper than any words could express. The hatred that had driven her actions had been transformed into protection that had preserved the lives of everyone she had once sought to destroy. But questions remained about her ultimate fate and the forces that had enabled her transformation from enemy agent into spiritual guardian. Her body was never found despite extensive searches, leading to speculation that she had been claimed by spiritual powers that existed beyond normal human understanding. The baby she had left behind showed no adverse effects from the night's supernatural events, growing stronger and more alert with each passing day, as if he had been nourished rather than drained by the spiritual forces that had flowed through him. His presence in the village became a source of both comfort and unease, as people struggled to understand his role in the events that had saved their community. Chief Oconee took personal responsibility for raising his grandson, though the task proved more challenging than any military campaign he had ever conducted. The child seemed to possess unusual awareness of his surroundings, and unusual reactions to people and situations that suggested sensitivity to spiritual dimensions that remained invisible to normal perception. More troubling were the changes that began affecting Chief Oconee himself in the weeks and months following the battle. His sleep became increasingly restless, filled with dreams that seemed more like visitations from his daughter's spirit than normal unconscious processing of daily experiences. In these dreams, Itzel would appear to him as she had been during their final conversation, but transformed by spiritual forces that had burned away the hatred and manipulation that had once defined her character. She would speak to him about the choices that had shaped both their lives, offering forgiveness for past mistakes, while warning about future challenges that would test his wisdom and courage. But most disturbing were her warnings about the price that spiritual protection always demanded from those who received its benefits. The ritual that had saved his community had created obligations that would follow him for the remainder of his life, responsibilities that went far beyond normal leadership duties to encompass spiritual dimensions that he was only beginning to understand. "The branch I broke cannot be restored," she would tell him in these visitations, her voice carrying sadness that transcended personal loss to encompass the cosmic implications of her actions. "The connections I severed to protect our people have created permanent changes in the spiritual fabric that surrounds this place." As months turned to years, the truth of these warnings became increasingly apparent in ways that affected every aspect of Chief Oconee's existence. His ability to sleep peacefully never returned, as the spiritual forces that flowed through their village continued to call to him during the hours when normal consciousness retreated and deeper awareness emerged. The broken branch remained on the altar where Itzel had placed it, becoming a focus for prayers and offerings from village members who recognized its significance even if they could not fully understand its power. But its presence also served as a constant reminder of the sacrifice that had saved them and the ongoing spiritual obligations that such salvation had created. Chief Akoni's grandson grew into a child whose unusual abilities became more apparent with each passing season. He could sense approaching weather changes days before they arrived, communicate with animals in ways that transcended normal understanding, and perceive spiritual presences that remained invisible to everyone else in their community. But perhaps most significantly, the boy showed an uncanny ability to calm conflicts and heal emotional wounds through his mere presence, as if the protective powers that had flowed through him during his first night of life continued to work through him in more subtle ways. The village prospered under Chief Akoni's continued leadership, but its prosperity came at the cost of his personal peace, as the spiritual obligations created by his daughter's sacrifice continued to demand attention that normal human consciousness could barely sustain. His advisors noticed the changes in their leader's behavior and health, but none dared to suggest that he might need to step down from his position or seek spiritual healing that might address the supernatural burden he carried. The community had been saved through his family's sacrifice, and questioning the price of that salvation seemed both ungrateful and potentially dangerous. As Chief Akoni entered the final years of his leadership, he often stood beside the altar where the broken branch continued to rest, speaking quietly to the daughter whose spirit he believed continued to watch over their people. These conversations provided his only relief from the restless energy that prevented normal sleep, while also serving as preparation for the day when he would join her in whatever realm awaited those who had been transformed by supernatural forces. The baby who had been born with his grandfather's birthmark grew into a young man whose very existence served as living proof that love could transcend hatred, that sacrifice could transform enemies into protectors, and that some mysteries were too profound for human understanding to fully grasp. But the broken branch on the altar continued to remind everyone who saw it that such transformations came at prices that were paid not just by those who chose sacrifice, but by all those who benefited from their protection. The spiritual fabric of their community had been permanently altered by the events that saved them, creating obligations and opportunities that would shape their destiny for generations yet to come. Chief Akoni never found peace in sleep again, but he found purpose in ensuring that the sacrifice his daughter had made would continue to protect and nurture the people she had died to save. The broken branch became his guide and his burden, a symbol of love that had transcended betrayal and redemption, that had emerged from the deepest darkness. In his final years, when age and spiritual exhaustion finally began to claim him, Chief Akoni would often be found beside the altar in the hours before dawn, speaking softly to shadows that might have been memories, or might have been visitations, from realms where his daughter's spirit continued to serve as guardian for the community she had chosen to protect with her life. The village children who discovered him there would report that he seemed to be listening to something they could not hear, responding to voices that spoke words of comfort and guidance that came from sources beyond their ability to perceive. But his grandson, now grown into a young man whose spiritual awareness exceeded even that of the tribal elders, would simply smile and say that his grandfather was receiving the reports that spirits must give to those who carry responsibility for protecting the living. When Chief Akoni finally died in his sleep many years later, he was found beside the altar with his hand resting on the broken branch that had defined the spiritual landscape of their community, since the night when love had conquered hatred and sacrifice had transformed enemies into eternal guardians. The broken branch remained where Itzel had placed it, serving future generations as a reminder that some mysteries transcended human understanding while offering protection that was both beautiful and terrible in its implications. And in the silence of certain nights, when the wind moved through the village in patterns that seemed almost like whispers, people claimed they could still hear the voices of father and daughter speaking together about the choices that had shaped their community's destiny and the spiritual obligations that would guide its future until the end of time.